Fast Forward Productions. The women are speaking.
If we want to turn the ship around where we don't have an area the size of Washington State that's mowed turf, then it literally happens one person at a time, 1 yard at a time. It's your birthright to be able to play with the soil and play with seeds and plants and learn.
You're listening to the Good Dirt Podcast. This is a place where we dig into the nitty-gritty of sustainable living through food, fashion, and lifestyle.
And we're your hosts, Mary and Emma Kingsley, the mother and daughter founder team of Lady Farmer. We're sowing seeds of slow living through our community platform, events, and online marketplace.
We started this podcast as a means to share the wealth of information and quality conversations that we're having in our world as we dream up and deliver ways for each of us to live into the new paradigm, one that is regenerative, balanced, and whole.
We want to put the microphone in front of the voices that need to be heard the most right now, the farmers, the dreamers, the designers, and the doers.
So come cultivate a better world with us. We're so glad you're here. Now, let's dig in.
Everyone, welcome to the Good Dirt Podcast. It's Friday morning. This is Mary and Emma coming at you from the Washington, D.C. area. I live in D.C. and my mom, Mary, lives on a farm in Maryland, Maryland. And we're here for you with another great interview. But before we get started, we just wanted to chat a little bit about how we're doing and how summer is faring. It's very hot. I don't know if it's hot where you are. It's very hot where we are. I think record temps this week. Don't they say that every summer? Record temps this week. Anyways.
It seems like it. But maybe it is record temps every week.
Every week.
Maybe we're just getting hotter and hotter and hotter.
Yeah. And I don't know if it's because I'm getting older and wiser or something, but you know, I kind of like this summer just heat. I like it when it's summer. When it's summer, I like it.
I grew up without air conditioning in the 60s and 70s. In our current house, this old farmhouse, we do have air conditioning upstairs for sleeping, but the rest of the house is not. So I get that good old-fashioned nostalgic summertime.
Summer sweat.
Yeah, feel. And I kind of like it. I was talking to your dad about that this morning, like, I just want to be in summer. And that's part of it, I think, being hot. Not that, I love it all the time, but I don't know. It's part of it.
So what are some other being in summer things that you like to do?
Oh, wow. I just kind of live on the porch during this time of year because it's cooler. We've got fans going out there. I spend a lot of time outside in the garden more in the morning and the evening. In the middle part of the day, I tend to be inside working and on the porch and staying cooler. Yeah.
I like berries, turning them into baked goods. And I also like going swimming in either the creek or the pool. I forget if I talked about this last summer at all, but last summer I found our neighborhood pool, like the closest city pool, which I'm not going to tell the secret over the podcast. I don't want to give it away, but it's a very, unless I did last summer, it's a very not well-attended city pool, but very well kept. And the lifeguards are super nice and it's free with the city, with the DC license, and no one goes there, and feels like my personal pool. So I like doing that.
That is awesome. I haven't been to a swimming pool in a long time. I don't know why.
Well, I mean, I'm exaggerating when I say no one goes there. The only people who go there, it's everyone speaking a different language. I think it must be a bunch of diplomat families or something and little kids in camp, but it's not a lot of people. And I don't know. It's not crowded and lots of different languages. It's fun. I really like going and just doing nothing. That's what pools are for.
Well, while you were out here at the farm for 2 weeks, farm sitting while we were in France, and you didn't have the pool.
No, I did not have the pool.
What'd you do to stay cool? Did you go to the creek?
I meant to make it to the creek when I was there. I didn't actually go to the creek during that time. But I did do lots of berry picking, lots of early morning walks to avoid the heat, and lots of porch sitting. I don't like going to the creek if it's just by myself. And I didn't really have people. A lot of people were out of town, so I didn't have my normal creek people to go to the creek with. I did have guests, but they had a newborn baby, and so we weren't going to creek with them. Guests were very fun to host. We cooked. We made some awesome meals, and we went on a couple walks and also just sat on the porch, especially with a baby. That's what you do. You sit.
I wanted to ask you, did your guests have anything to say about our greatly reduced mowing experiment?
Oh, yes. I can't recall. I think they were just excited to be here, and it looks really cool. So I think they're just like, wow, this looks awesome. There wasn't a whole lot of judgment or anything like that. Really quickly, because I feel like that's getting sort of into the conversation that we're having today, I did want to say for anyone listening who is a fan of this podcast, has been listening, or whether you're new or been around, we are so excited to keep this show going and growing. And something that really helps us do that is if you leave a review for us, which is pretty easy on the Apple Podcasts app. I know specifically that's where I have left reviews for podcasts that I love. But just a few words about why you like this podcast and what it is you like about it will really help us and really help other people find the good dirt. So thank you so much for doing that.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Getting back to today's interview has a lot to do with no mowing and has really kind of this one, Mom, and this person that we talked to and this book that he wrote really has shifted a big part of what you've been doing at the farm, like in a really big way. And I feel like we've said that a lot recently about our interviews, but this one really is.
Oh, yes, in a big way.
Our guest for today is Owen Wormser. So Owen was born and raised off the grid in rural Maine, which, as you'll hear in this interview, is something that I am personally fascinated with, that people actually do that. They do. He was surrounded by the natural world, with the nature being his greatest teacher. Throughout his life, he has cultivated skills and perspectives necessary to help weave people and the natural world back together. His interest in nature, plants, and design led him to study landscape architecture. After getting his degree in 1998, he settled in Western Massachusetts to start his first landscape design and installation company. Since then, he has built hundreds of regenerative landscapes influenced by his study of horticulture, permaculture, organic agriculture, and ecology.
In 2016, he co-founded Local Harmony, which is a nonprofit that promotes local regenerative projects. The second edition of his first book, Lawns Into Meadows, Growing a Regenerative Landscape, was released in November 2022. So this interview with Owen is one of several in recent months that I feel personally has really shifted my own relationship to the land around me. He joins Mary Reynolds and Marie Rodell, and we will link those particular episodes in the show notes, to create what I'll call a sort of triad of influences, each with their own style and emphasis. And I have felt so encouraged and empowered to let go and view this landscape that I have the privilege to steward less as something that I need to create and more of its own entity that I can allow to emerge. It's so exciting and fun, and I feel very enriched by the guidance and wisdom of these mentors. And we both learned so much from this conversation with Owen, and we really appreciate what he brings to this discussion on creating regenerative landscapes.
So without further ado, here is Owen Wormser, the author of Lawns Into Meadows.
So thanks for having me. And I have always been interested in plants. I grew up in a situation where I was very close to the natural world and I was drawn to it at a young age. As a child, it wasn't something that I was necessarily aware of in that way, that it was just something that was there around me. My nearest neighbor was a half-mile away, and my parents raised me without electricity. They were back to the landers and grew a lot of their own food And so I was very close to the natural world, and I was interested in what was around me. And I knew that I wanted to keep that connection. And I pursued a degree in landscape architecture for my bachelor's so that I could continue to be around the land and plants. And it was really probably at that age that I started to sort of consciously learn about ecology and the natural world. So before that, it was just something that, I don't know, was sort of second nature, but it was not something that I was, I guess, consciously pursuing. And then I got my degree in landscape architecture and got a design background, which was very helpful. But really, my education started when I began my first design build company in 1998. Since then, I've been putting in hundreds of landscapes, and I've been focusing on low maintenance, ecologically oriented landscapes. And so a lot of my perspective is just coming from firsthand experience that I've gained. And one of the key pieces of that, I think, that has come to be really clear over the course of time is that initially I thought I was going to be helping to save the planet. And after doing it for about 10 years, I realized that the planet was saving me, and that the plants and working with the soil and nature was actually a really healing experience. And so I continue to learn from working with plants and working with nature and design. That's kind of how I came to the situation where I'm talking about meadows.
Okay. I first discovered your book, and I heard you on a webinar, and I became very, very entranced with this topic of Lawns to Meadows. So you want to tell us about your book and the premise of it, and, why you wrote it, and just, tell us all about that.
Yeah, I wrote it because the opportunity came up to address a really important subject. In this country, we have an area that is the size of Washington State that is mowed turf. So if you took all the lawns and put them together, they would equal the footprint of Washington State, which is massive. And I knew already that lawns were environmentally detrimental, but researching the book, I learned how impactful they are ecologically. And it's enormous. It's really across the board in so many different ways. Meadows offer a solution that is actually giving something back to the ecology around us. And considering that most lawns aren't used, it's a really worthwhile thing to do. I don't advocate getting rid of all lawns because some lawns have value. We play games on them, or children need some space to kick a ball around, whatever it might be. You might need paths going through your meadow, and mowing them can work really well. But that said, there's all this turf that we put an enormous amount of money and time and all these other resources, including chemicals and fuel. We keep putting all this, tens of billions of dollars a year into lawn care, and we don't really need to do that. And meadows offer something that's really low maintenance and ecologically very valuable and also beautiful. So that's really kind of the crux of what's behind the book, explaining how to do that. And I wrote it because I wanted to address all of those topics.
So when we started to talk last week, you talked a little bit about growing up in rural Maine. And I wondered if we could kind of go back there. You touched on it a little bit, but I just wonder if you could speak a little bit more about your upbringing into what got you to what you're doing now with Lawns Into Meadows.
Sure. I grew up in a situation where my parents were inspired by, once upon a time, a very well-known book by Helen and Scott Naring called The Good Life. And a lot of people read it in the late 60s. It had been out, I think, since the early 60s, maybe even earlier. But it influenced a lot of people of that generation to move into the country. And my parents were inspired by that book and other factors, and they ended up in rural Maine, which was kind of a haphazard choice. There were just circumstances that led to that situation. And for anybody who's interested in this sort of topic, my father's actually an author, and he has a memoir called The Road Washes Out in Spring that was just re-released in early March by Brandeis University Press. So I'm going to plug that book because it's a really wonderful book. I'm quite fond of it. And it describes living off the grid for almost 25 years, which was how I grew up. And so my parents didn't plan to do this. They ended up actually moving to a situation. It's just kind of funny because it's haphazard. They moved farther from the power lines than the power company would bring in power for free. So they ended up would have had to pay for it, which they intended to do. And they just had to scrape together the money and they were going to do it. And then a year or two went by and they realized that they liked living without electricity. So they grew a lot of their own food and raised me with an organic diet. And I grew up with a lot of awareness that I guess previously we would call alternative, for better and for worse. And a lot of these topics have become pretty mainstream. And one of them is this whole thing about mowing less and having gardens that are of more ecological value. It's interesting that these areas are becoming an area of topics of wide interest because people have been talking about them for many decades, since the 1960s, and Silent Spring, and a lot of these issues have come up. So it's wonderful that people are really coming to understand the importance of some of these subjects. And it's something that's near and dear to my heart because of how I grew up and just my inclination towards protecting the environment and taking care of the earth.
I'm just curious, as a little boy, did you read by candlelight or firelight?
We had kerosene lamps and we heated with wood entirely, an outhouse and a pump inside the house that was connected to a dug well, and we had a drilled well outside. It was a very simple existence. And the thing about it is that when you're a child and you grow up in an environment, you just get used to it. That's what you know. And so there's something about that which is very simple. There's a simplicity to it. It's a lot of work, which is to not romanticize it. My parents worked really, really hard to make all of this happen, but the simplicity is wonderful. We live in such a complicated world that we make complicated as humans. And we have technology, of course, and all these other things that we're concerned about, we're thinking about, that we're anxious about. And when you live close to the seasons and you live close to the cycles of nature, there's something about that can't be duplicated in any other way. So without that experience, it's an idea still. And I got to experience that and I miss it, honestly. Part of my interest is to share some of my ability to connect to nature with other people because it is of so much value. And I want to see if I can share that with the world because I know that I have it and I can always fall back on that connection. I could always go live in a cabin in the woods and be perfectly happy. I think people think that there's sort of a lot to it, but really it's a very simple existence in a way that, I don't know, I encourage people to experiment with simplicity in that way.
Well, it makes me think about too how when you said we live in a really complicated world and it's there's no way out of that really. And it's either we are working for our daily survival and our daily needs, which is that simplicity that's very fulfilling and it fills a lot of that kind of discomfort is working towards that. If we don't have that, if we just take all those shortcuts with, flipping a light switch on and turning the heat or AC on or just turning on the faucet, then we have all of this. Yes, we've made it very convenient for ourselves and we've taken a lot of work out of the day, But we replace that with like existential anxiety, I guess. That I guess also there's really no escape from that either. But we create a lot of problems because we've solved this other thing. So it's really interesting. We're not actually, we think it's a shortcut, but really it's just more problems.
I think I can appreciate what you're saying. And it's tricky because all of the modern conveniences that we've created for ourselves do save us an enormous amount of time. If you have to pump your water and heat it up to take a bath or a shower, it's not convenient. Most people aren't able to live that way because if you want to engage with the world of time. So we created a situation where we can do that, but then what do we fill our time with? So it's a really more than the fundamentals of how you do sort of create simplicity. It's a matter of, to me, the crux of it is how do you use your time and how do you use these amazing conveniences that we have?
Yeah, we like to ask that question a lot on here when we trade out these tasks and utilize these modern conveniences. What are we trading for? And looking back, so far, a really huge one that we traded out in the last century was growing our own food. In the early 20th century, about half the people in the United States lived on a farm and worked on a farm. And, all of a sudden now it's like less than 5% or, 2%, 3%, whatever it is. Very small percentage of people actually work on farms. And so we've all, traded out that really basic human task, growing at least some of our own food with all these other things, all these jobs and things. And that's, it's not to blame anybody. It's just where the system has evolved. It does beg the question that we're just asking here, like, what comprises a life of satisfaction and abundance and, fulfillment? Is it the perfect job? Is it having your food in your backyard? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but
it's very complicated and it varies so much person to person. But I would say, and relevant to your listeners in this podcast, is that a connection to nature is incredibly gratifying and helps us realize that we're part of it. Everything that's material in our lives, and including our food, it came from the earth. Just understanding that and feeling that connection is somehow very gratifying.
Do you ever think about going back off the grid?
No, I haven't thought about pursuing that.
Well, understanding, or at least becoming conscious of, it's very, very easy in our current way of living to be disconnected from nature. And just to bring that to consciousness and do some relatively simple things to try to make that reconnection in your own life can go a really, really long way.
It can. I mean, and we're part of nature. Your cell phone came from the ground. It was manufactured out of minerals that people dug out of the earth and refined and went through this amazing process to create this technology. But the bottom line is, without things coming from the earth, we have nothing. And so I think just understanding that is helpful because humans tend to be so self-involved. I'm guilty of it. We're all guilty of it. And if you have a connection to nature, then you have a connection to something that's bigger than us. And there's something about that that's really helpful and reassuring.
So you were formally trained in landscape design. That's correct?
Yeah, I studied landscape architecture. I studied landscape architecture in college, got a degree.
So I'm interested in knowing, when you did that, did you find, how did your own goals and your values and what you brought from your own upbringing and your own appreciation for natures and the cycles of nature and so forth, how did that meet up with what you were learning in school, your formal training? And where did that create any conflict or any, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm old enough so that there was really no ecological focus in my landscape architecture program in the mid 90s. And it changed immediately after I left. like within a couple of years, the whole educational focus in that field shifted, and it wasn't just focusing on modernism and design for the sake of design, which, has its value for sure. But my interest was ecological, and there was very little of that happening at that point. It really wasn't until around 2000 that started to shift. And now, all landscape architecture programs have a strong ecological focus. So I think it's indicative of the sea change that is happening in terms of our culture and our society actually turning their attention to these topics like ecology.
So while you were going through school, were you just like, gee, how did that make you feel that your formal training that was supposedly teaching you or preparing you for this professional career was leading you in a direction which was not what was inside you?
I felt that way in general about my schooling. I was not one of those people that was really oriented or inclined towards school. And I got some really good education along the way. So it wasn't like I didn't appreciate parts of it, but I am someone who learns a lot experientially, and being out in the world is really valuable for me in that way.
Do you think your training prepared you for what you're doing now?
A little bit. The design underpinning that I learned in college is very helpful and very important. Creating beauty and functional design is really critical to creating landscapes that people appreciate. Without those things, they're not something that people are really going to be interested in, and they're certainly not going to want to involve themselves in them or build them in their own yards or anything like that.
Why do we want to turn lawns into meadows?
Well, there's numerous reasons, and one of them is what I was just talking about, beauty. Meadows are beautiful. They have color, they have texture, and they bring in a lot of life. So you're going to see birds, and you're going to see insects, you're going to see pollinators. All of those things show up when you have a meadow. And then meadows also have enormous ecological value. So you're contributing something to a web of light, really, which helps turn the tide in that direction. So meadows can sink a large amount of carbon. They're really, really good at sequestering carbon, on par with oceans and forests. And they don't require maintenance once they're established. Very little. Like once a year, they need to be mowed. And they don't need fertilizer. They don't need water. They have a very small footprint in terms of the resources they use. And really, they offer a lot.
I guess we should also back up and have you tell us what is a meadow?
Good question. Because meadow isn't a very technical term. There are all these words that relate to grasslands, and meadows are grassland. And prairie is a grassland, and plains. In Asia, the word steppe. You hear the word savanna. There are all these different words, and really they're areas that are dominated by grasses with flowering perennial herbaceous species in them that aren't overtaken by trees and shrubs, really. That's essentially what a meadow is and what a grassland is. And they're typically, historically, maintained by fire and grazing. And now mowing has been introduced into the mix as well.
So for your typical client, now, first of all, let me ask this. In your work, is this lawn to meadow or this sort of regenerative landscape, natural landscape? That's your focus, correct?
It's actually just a slice of what I do. I am focused on creating a really wide range of landscapes, and there's a low maintenance, sustainable theme that runs through them all. But I have learned how to build meadows because they're the ultimate low maintenance landscape. But I do stonework. and build water gardens and have built Japanese style gardens and permaculture gardens. And so really anything that falls into the range of enhancing the value for people and animals, whether it's aesthetic or food or, plants for wildlife, I've done a lot of all of the above.
So I'm curious about your typical client. They come to you looking for this, or do you educate people on the advantages of this kind of thing? Do you sort of guide people into this, or are people already in the know and they say, I want you to do this for me? How does that work?
In the last 5 years or so, people are in the know, especially where I live in Western Massachusetts, pretty well-educated, progressive community of people. In the previous years before that, maybe the last 10 or 12 years, there's been people looking for this type of work, but it's definitely picked up in the last 5 years because prior to that, people weren't really aware that this was an option, that having a sustainable landscape or getting rid of your lawn or growing food in your yard was something you could just go do. It was something that still seemed alternative and weird. And that's really the long and short of it. That's changed. And 20 years ago, very, very few people were taking up their lawn to build a meadow.
Would you say there was past active resistance to it? Like, do people go, we can't do that. It'll be too many bugs, or there'll be too many ticks, or whatever.
Well, yeah. I mean, there was resistance to the point that no one even, like I said, it wouldn't have occurred to them that they could do something like that. And for those that did want to do something like that, if they were in a neighborhood, they were really concerned about getting rid of their lawn. So, I mean, that's still an issue for a decent amount of people, but much less so than it used to be.
Do you have any stories or encounters of people's struggles with their homeowners associations?
Well, I hear a lot of feedback from people who run into resistance. And then over the years, if you follow the news, you'll see a story or two a year that has to do with some sort of violent interaction based on people's passion about lawns and maintaining lawns. And those are just the ones that make it into the news. So it's a big deal for people and they feel really strongly about it. And that's real. I mean, something that one has to work with and kind of be at least respectful of, because that's people's feelings and they feel strongly about it. But I got into education around this stuff because really that's the only way to get things to shift. And initially with my work, I did spend more time educating people on the value of gardening more ecologically. And now I do very little of that now. But yeah, education is so important in terms of shifting some of that resistance to getting rid of lawns and gardening differently.
Why do you think there is such an attachment to the idea of the lawn in our culture?
Humans are traditionalists in the sense that what they know they like. That's part of it, just human nature. But I think, there is this cultural sense of achievement that comes with having a lawn, both the control over it and the sort of status that comes with that. Because lawns, up until the 1850s, when the reel mower was invented, were something that only very wealthy people, pretty much primarily in Western Europe, is where really it came from. The wealthy landowners were able to pay people essentially to be out with shears to clear a lawn, because you could have sheep eat your grass, but they also leave droppings. So it's different if you're trying to play croquet or something. If you have sheep as opposed to some local peasants shearing your grass. So it's a status symbol. And when the reel mower was developed, it wasn't very accessible for most people just because it was bulky. But by the 1950s, when the mass-produced gas-powered mower became really affordable and ubiquitous, everybody could be a king, so to speak. There is a sense of status, and people, I believe, are probably attached to that. It's very common when someone lets their lawn grow up without tilling it or planting a meadow, but they just allow it to grow up into a meadow. People typically assume something very bad happened. Someone died, someone went into bankruptcy, but there was some sort of large catastrophic event. And that's a typical assumption. So I think that lends credence to this idea that all is well if you have a lawn.
Yes. We just interviewed Mary Reynolds. Her suggestion is to put up a sign that explains and give, the website, the ARC website, and so people know that it's intentional. I'm doing some of this myself and letting areas of our lawn go and so forth. And, I've already had questions already. And it's late April, A neighbor was over the other night and I said, we're doing an experiment this year. We're mowing less, we're growing more wild areas. And she goes, oh, I just thought it was because you'd been out of town. And the other neighbor said, well, we were wondering what was going on. So it takes a lot of explanation. I don't have my sign up yet, but
Signs are great.
yeah. Or I don't know. This is intentional, but this is an experiment. Or, you go to parks and things and you'll see things like, oh, this is a restoration area. Don't step here. Or that kind of, and people go, oh, okay. Then they sort of get it. And that does explain it. It is a restoration area. Speaking of which, for people listening to this and, they're like, maybe light bulbs are going off and, I want to do this. What's the first step in it? Not that you're going to completely learn how to turn your lawn into a meadow from listening to this podcast. It's a little more involved than that. But where would you tell someone to start? Maybe this is the first they've heard of it and it's very exciting.
Yeah. So I always encourage people to bite off what they're comfortable with. It's almost like an investment. You don't want to do something that you feel is risky. If you're new to working with plants, maybe that means you're starting with a 5x5 area in your backyard and you're taking up the grass and you're planting into that. But if you're already really comfortable with gardening and plants, like maybe you're going to turn your whole backyard into a meadow, but you want to do that first, maybe before you do your front yard. So it's all relative to sort of your situation and who you are in regard to doing this type of work. But in Lawns Into Meadows, I talk about different approaches, and you can start with a blank slate where you get rid of the grass entirely and start with bare soil, or you can just take seed and sprinkle it into the grass and let it grow. And there's sort of steps in between those two. So there's kind of a spectrum, different ways to plant meadows. And I really try in my book to make it clear that whatever gets results is essentially the right way. And so some people are able to get results just sprinkling seed into a lawn and then letting it grow up. You're dealing with different grasses. A lot of times they're non-native grasses. It's more of a crapshoot. You have to make sure that hope that the seeds make soil contact to establish. There's more variables if you go that route. Whereas if you start with a blank slate, you have more control over what establishes. So generally, I try to steer people in that direction, but it's all about sort of what you can do and what you're comfortable doing.
Well, okay. So say you've had sprinkled your seeds, or you've planted something, or you've decided to make a change. Is there any amount of, what does maintenance look like, I guess then? Is there any amount of mowing, or what does maintaining a meadow look like?
When it's establishing, there is some spot weeding and maybe curating and editing out anything that you don't want with a weed whacker or a scythe or a sickle. That's usually helpful. You certainly want to discourage things that you don't want while the meadow is establishing. Annual weeds are less of a concern if they show up, because the perennials that you're planting to live there in the long term generally are able to dominate the annuals once the perennials start to establish. But native perennials take 2 to 3 years, 4 to 5 years in some cases, before they really start to fill out and show up fully. So during that stretch of time, it's very helpful to watch your meadow closely. You don't really want to do more to it than you have to, which if you've prepped it well and there aren't really any weeds or plants that you're concerned about, you're really not doing anything. You're letting it grow. You're watching it and you're trusting that those seeds are going to establish and do what you hope they're going to do. And so you just have to be patient. And that's a huge component establishing a perennial meadow is being patient, because once you get to that point where those plants are there and they're full and the meadow's filled out, then generally speaking, it only needs to be mowed, or preferably, if you're able to do this isn't generally accessible to most people. Hopefully that will change, but burn your meadow. But mowing and cutting everything back in the spring is really the one round of maintenance that's required with an established meadow.
So I have a question about, you said one way to begin, one of the options is to sprinkle seed and hope it takes, but would you remove some of the grass where you're sprinkling seed? Would you create a bare spot? Or seems to me if you just sprinkle out there on the grass, it's not going to get into the dirt enough to catch on.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to get soil contact if you're just sprinkling it into the grass. I've had success using a drill seeder, which scores into the lawn and deposits the seed into that. So that's an approach that people can use. But usually I like to till the lawn under. And there's a couple advantages to this. And tilling kind of has a bad name these days. But really, you're just doing this 2 or 3 times to get rid of the grass. But in the process, you're turning the grass into the soil. So you're doing it once, and then any grass that grows up again, you're waiting to resprout, usually 2 to 3 weeks, depends on the weather, temperature, and moisture. But then you till everything under again. And what that does is it does a couple things. It puts the grass and that organic matter back into the soil, which a lot of times with lawns is really helpful, because a lot of times the soil is dead or close to it, chemical use and fertilizers and that kind of thing. Just compaction and sun scald and things like that can make the soil less healthy. So putting that organic matter back in can be really advantageous, but disturbing the soil also generally stimulates the seed bank of weeds to sprout. And then you till those under and you exhaust that seed bank. So those are 2 really important reasons why tilling works. And then the third reason for me personally is that I don't use herbicides because I'm trying to create pollinator habitat. And there's this really long track record, over 100 years now, where things that are deemed safe are found to be unsafe 20 or 30 or 40 years later. And we're seeing that with glyphosate now, where we know that internally it was known to cause cancer, and now it's finally been proven to cause cancer, and it's still used widely. So when trying to create pollinator habitat and ecological value, I personally try to really avoid using herbicides and chemicals. That said, there are situations from an ecological perspective where maybe they are, okay when used really in a focused way, like when people paint knotweed or something like that. So I don't want to be on a high horse here and say don't ever use those, but I think it's really important to be mindful of that. And personally, I don't have to use them. I've never had to, because I'm always able to find other solutions.
So I was wondering in my own little project back here. So I've got these areas of grass that are coming up, and if I dug up some already established perennials like coneflowers, for instance, I have them popping up all over the place. They're really healthy. Just dug those up with a big root ball and maybe stuck them in the middle of one of these areas that's just grass, and just sort of put it there and establish it there. Is that a technique as well?
Absolutely. Sometimes I'll do that where I'll put plugs into a freshly seeded meadow in prominent locations, because plugs will be able to establish usually within the first season. If you plant them in the spring, by summer, they're already starting to fill out and flower. So that gives you some perennial color beginning right away. And you can also plant plugs into existing turf or sort of in any combination that you can make work. If you do plant them into existing turf and then let it grow up into a meadow, you just have to mark where all the plugs are and make sure that they don't get overtaken by grass and get shaded out, because they just have to establish. Once they're established after a year or so, they can hold their own. But also you want to know where they are so you can keep them from getting eaten when they're little.
Yeah, that seems to me like a fairly doable technique. And I know that all around, in the grass, it just, this wild yarrow comes up. We call it field yarrow. And if you let it grow, it just in one season, it gets really big and has all these big flowers on it. And so that's something that, I could just let go, or even move those around and stick those around in the grass. And anyway, well, thank you. You give me some really good ideas. It's a little daunting. You stop mowing and you look out there and you've got, hey, there's some really long grass out there. And then what's next? So thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah, a lot of those species over the course of time actually just kind of will show up. So certain plants like yarrow or certain types of phlox, or there's a pretty wide range of perennials that like open field to grow in, and they appear too. So there is over time a possibility that you can curate a meadow simply by letting things grow and seeing what shows up.
We have a lot of chicory too. The blue flower all around. I bet you have that up there, huh?
Oh, yeah. And, a lot of these plants like yarrow and chicory, these are plants that you see growing on the side of highways and roads. And it's important to remember that meadow plants many of them are very resilient, and they don't even care if they have good conditions. In fact, many of them thrive in poor conditions. So you don't necessarily need a good site. And that's one of the really wonderful advantages of meadows, is that you don't have to add soil or fertilizer or anything. There's been a lot of mine restoration with using meadows. So they'll clear or flatten, bulldoze mine tailings and then plant meadows on them, and they establish well.
Owen, do you have any particularly favorite projects that stand out, or anything you're particularly proud of?
My more public projects are, I think, the most rewarding. So with meadows, I was able to design a meadow at the Eric Carle Museum for picture book art, which is in Amherst, Mass. That was actually a situation where I was planting it into an old apple orchard. The trees are over 100 years old and they had mowed turf under them, but we couldn't take up the turf because we didn't want to destroy or disturb the roots of the apple trees. So we weren't able to till. We didn't want to use herbicides, especially since it's a space that children would be playing in. And we ended up using a drill seeder. And I had researched it. I couldn't find any information on planting a meadow with a drill seeder. All the other experts that are out there, they basically say, don't plant into existing. And the other people that I talk to that I know around where I live and our colleagues, they also didn't have experience doing this. So it was really just kind of a crapshoot. And that ended up working. The grass that comprised the lawn grew up and became a beautiful meadow. And the vast majority of the plants, the vast majority of the species that we were planting established. So now 5 years later, it's a really full, beautiful meadow, and it gets used by children as an educational opportunity. So they get to see this meadow filled with butterflies and pollinators. And it's really gratifying to see that happen on the ground. It's great.
We've actually been to that museum. In fact, well, our middle son went to Hampshire College, and that's on those grounds.
Yeah.
And so we were there in 2005 8, 9, 10, something like that. And it was before you did this, but I would love to see it. And what an appropriate place to put a meadow in. Eric Carle, the children's illustrator, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, and all those classic books that were so important to my children growing up, and just a wonderful example of nature education. And so that's exciting. So you live in that area around Amherst and so forth.
Exactly.
Any other museums or anything, or like any other cool opportunities like that?
There's 5 colleges in this little area. So all the resources that they have are, available in terms of like Smith College is here. They have an art museum that's pretty impressive. And there's Amherst College in Hampshire and UMass and Mount Holyoke. So it's an unusual little area with all of these schools.
So your book is very, very informative. It even has charts of plants, and it's a very good guide, a good step-by-step guide to this.
Yeah, so I think it's important for people to remember that they're collaborating with nature, with these species that are ultimately going to do the bulk of the work. They're going to grow, they're going to fill out that space. And so you are helping that happen. So whatever gets results is what works. And I think people get really concerned that they're not doing it right. But that's something, I mention this because it's important to have perspective that very few of us in this country, in America, have been exposed to how to do this sort of thing. You don't have like someone who taught you, or even many examples of meadows that people have been exposed to. And then most people don't know plant species that well. And there's hundreds and hundreds of native meadow species that you can use. So it can be really feel overwhelming and intimidating. And so it's important to remember that for those of us that are considered experts, like we're still learning, and it's an endless process. And there's so much complexity to it in ways that is actually reassuring, because you don't have to understand it all. You just have to get some plants to grow and create whatever value you can with the species in the area that you're able to work with. So it's really a matter of kind of rebuilding our ecological knowledge, and the way that we are able to do that is by engaging. And so that's the most important thing. If you want to learn how to do this, you just have to engage. You can only learn so much through books. You just have to do it.
That's awesome. And I think that sort of goes along the lines with my next question, which is something we always ask on this podcast, because it's a podcast about slow living and sustainable living. So what do you think about slow living, and how are you able to engage with slow living in your life?
It's ironic because I've been very busy the last couple of years of my life, especially in ways that make me kind of uncomfortable, related to what we were talking about how I grew up, and that I do know in my bones this slower pace. And I haven't been experiencing that in recent years. I am able to find it through my own spiritual practice and meditation, and also being in nature. And so within that frenetic pace of daily life, I find it really essential for my well-being to carve out time to be still and to be quiet. And so I think I'd probably go crazy without it personally. It can be hard enough even when I am able to do that in my daily life. But yeah, without it, I'd probably be lost.
My mom says she's scared of what would happen if she doesn't meditate. That's why she meditates.
Well, that simplicity and that stillness is where we actually find our essence, our inspiration, and all of these things that actually really nurture and feed us. And it's not just our personality or all these ideas and thoughts. So there's something that's really sustaining if you're able to connect with that. And so being in nature is one way to access that. And that's one of the reasons that it's kind of funny, but it all ties together, because having a meadow in your backyard can help create an environment that pulls you into a meditative state, because it will attract light and it'll create wonder. And if you just sit there and you watch it, you're going to get pulled into it and you're going to lose yourself. You're not going to be thinking about how you have a bill due tomorrow or whatever is on your mind. You're going to be watching a bee go after, climb into beard tongue flowers. And you're going to be watching and learning. And that's something that is, for me, and I think a lot of people, whether they know it or not, really, really important.
Adding to something you said a few minutes ago about how you see life returning very quickly to these areas once you start cultivating this or letting it go. I can attest to that, just as some of the things we've done over the last couple of seasons and putting in some native plants and so forth. Life returns so quickly. It's just amazing. And before you know it, you're seeing birds and bees and bugs that you hadn't seen before. And there's even lots of more sounds. So it's not one of these things where, you have to wait 10 years to see results. It's really quick. Just shows you the resilience of nature and the earth. And, she wants to come back. She really, really wants to come back.
It's so reaffirming to see that, because we're so used to living in a degraded environment that we've essentially destroyed, and we feel bad about it, and rightfully so. But at the same time, just feeling guilty doesn't solve any problems. And at the same time as that, being able to see the abundance wants to be there and how quickly it can be there is really, really reaffirming that we live on this earth and we can actually be helpful here. We're not necessarily just these horrible creatures that are destroying everything. We can actually help create abundance and support ecology and support life.
And we literally can do it in our backyard, and we don't have to wait for laws to change or policy or leaders, or we don't have to wait for any of that stuff. We can do it literally in our backyard and see results. And that's just a very, very joyful thing. And I really want listeners to hear that. As you said, you can start with a window box. You can start with 5 square feet. You can start with an acre, wherever you want. So the other question we always ask our guests, and I have a feeling I know how you would answer this literally, but you can also answer it any way you want, metaphorically and so forth. What does the good dirt mean to you?
Yeah, so literally, soil is the foundation of life. So one of the things that we tend not in our culture to be educated on, because no one tells us, is how much life is in soil and how important it is to the health of everything on this planet. Good dirt is healthy soil filled with microbes and mycorrhizae and just teeming with life. And then in terms of the metaphor, everything grows out of the soil. So one of the best metaphors I've ever heard around this sort of thing is that if you can cultivate soil, then, eventually things will flourish. And the metaphor is that we can do this in our own lives. And working with building meadows is both engaging on the metaphorical level of learning that process of sort of creating abundance and creating more life, but also actually learning that we can grow and expand into more skill in these areas, and that we are the dirt ourselves in that way, that we can cultivate ourselves and expand our horizons and create a healthier planet.
Totally.
Thank you.
I love it.
Yeah.
You've given us so much encouragement and wisdom, and I think there's been so many nuggets in here. But if there's anything else that you want to leave with the audience, or anything else that you want the listeners to understand about the work that you're doing, or your book, or anything else that you're working on, is there anything else you want to leave with the listeners?
I think it's kind of a reiteration of what I've been saying, but I always encourage people to engage themselves, because that's where all this knowledge comes from, is people just experimenting and figuring it out. And so that might just mean that in your neighborhood, you figure out how to plant a successful meadow. And that means 4 or 5 of your neighbors over the course of the next 5 to 20 years, or maybe sooner, will also plant meadows, because you can help them and you will have learned. So it is a process, and if we want to sort of turn the ship around where we don't have an area the size of Washington State that's mowed turf, then it literally happens one person at a time, 1 yard at a time. And it's important to remember that because you can't just wait for experts to do it for you. They can give you perspective and information, but the only reason they're there, people like myself, we're doing this because we experimented and we've been learning how to do it. And so we need more of that. And that means if you're inclined in this direction, then it's your birthright to be able to play with the soil and play with seeds and plants and learn. Mm-hmm. And as Mary said, it's a joyful process. So at a minimum, you're going to have that engagement and it's going to enrich your life.
Totally. And I think it's also interesting to point out, for some reason, all of this stuff is or can feel so intimidating if someone's just starting out or, it's funny I catch myself quite often when I start to feel intimidated or overwhelmed, I'm like, well, what am I scared of? And especially with this, it's like, how can you really mess up? I don't know. You kind of can't. So it's really fun.
It's a really important perspective.
I just love what you said. It's our birthright. It is our birthright to engage with plants and seeds and the environment around us. And that's just so beautiful. And I want all of our listeners to take that with them into the rest of their day when they hear this.
Yeah. And they can tell that to their homeowner association.
Yes.
I guess maybe that's what people are scared of.
Well, they're scared of judgment. They're scared of judgment. They're scared of the neighbor going, what's going on over there?
We were worried about you, Mary. Everything okay?
Yeah. And they're scared of failure, understandably, because they want to do a good job. And so that's why it's important when I was saying to bite off what you can chew, start in an area that no one can see. Start in an area that no one cares about, in the back corner of your yard that your kids don't play on. And, maybe your spouse will laugh at you at first. But it's like, if you enjoy this, just do it and don't worry about it, because you don't have to turn your whole front lawn into a meadow if that's too much. You can do what you're comfortable with.
Yes.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much, Owen. This has been awesome.
I have enjoyed this conversation so much, and I've learned so many things. And you speak so articulately about what's behind the idea and the concept. And I just thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great conversation.
Where can people find you and your work if they are hoping to learn more from you?
Yeah, so my book, when it comes to meadows, is really the primary resource, which you can get from Stone Pier Press. You can find them online at stonepierpress.org, and you can buy it in most bookstores and online as well. And my website is abounddesign.com if you want to see some of my garden work. I unfortunately am not working outside of my local area for your listeners, just so you know, so I don't disappoint anybody if they contact me. Also, I have an Instagram account, Lawns Into Meadows, Lawns_into_meadows. And I do some podcasts regularly and some workshops online as well, which you can find out usually from my Instagram page.
Very cool. We will link to all of those things so people can find you.
Thank you.
Yeah, really. Thanks for having me. This is a fun conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Nice meeting you.
I'm going to go outside now and start moving my cone flowers into the ground.
Bye-bye. Thank you for tuning in, calling in, and spreading the good dirt. We love hearing from you. You can reach our listener voicemail at 443-459-1950. That's 443-459-1950. You can find this number in our show notes and in our Instagram profile.
This show is produced by Lady Farmer, a slow living lifestyle community, and the original music is composed and performed by John Kingsley.
For more from Lady Farmer, follow us on Instagram at We Are Lady Farmer. That's We Are Lady Farmer. Or join us online at www.ladyfarmer.com. We'll see you next time on The Good Dirt.
Goodbye.